Tariffs continue to put the Trump administration at odds with the world. President Trump saying this is part of his America First policy, and it's helping to make a lot of money for this country. But they're angering our neighbors. Some Canadian leaders, in particular the government of Ontario, trying to drive home their point by using the words of former President Ronald Reagan.
But over the long run, such trade barriers hurt every American worker and consumer. High tariffs inevitably lead to retaliation by foreign countries and the triggering of fierce trade wars. Then the worst happens. Markets shrink and collapse, businesses and industries shut down, and millions of people lose their jobs.
Made President Trump furious. He called it a fraud. Canada wouldn't immediately take it down, even airing it during the World Series. President Trump said because of this, he's cutting off trade negotiations with Canada and increasing tariffs by 10%. So here's the question. What did Ronald Reagan really think about tariffs? Joining us now is a man who actually knew Ronald Reagan. He was a special assistant to the former president and Mrs. Reagan in their post-presidency world. We're talking about Troy's Mayor Ethan Baker, a regular on the Pulse. And it is good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
You too, Roop.
We have you on a lot to talk about issues that deal with current day politics. Yeah. But what I find really interesting is that if you ask me, like, how many people in this country actually worked with and knew President Reagan, you're one of them. Yeah. What was his stance on tariffs? And was that ad that was out there, did it misrepresent what he really thought?
Yeah, I think there's a lot going on with that. Obviously, I want to start off by saying the ad, first of all, I thought it was a really good and compelling ad, and I think that's probably why it's getting so much attention. So in one respect, good for Ontario, good for Premier Ford. I mean, I think he got what he wanted in a certain sense, but it really backfired for him in another way I think we can talk about as well. But the president obviously was a free trade capitalist. He really was all about capitalism. And I rewatched the entire radio address from that 1987 speech that he gave, or the radio address that he did that was cut and spliced for the ad. And the irony is, just before the comments that were put in that commercial, he was talking about how he had just put tariffs on Japan for a specific reason. And so, he wasn't against the use of tariffs. He believed that they were a necessary tool at times, as I think most mainstream Republicans and most mainstream Americans believe there's a time and a place for tariffs.
So there's like two things that happened here. One, they spliced up the ad. Again, this was a radio address that was much longer. How long was the whole ad?
It was about 5 minutes.
So it was 5 minutes, and they put it down to like 45 seconds to a minute, and they spliced it, which is terrible. But when you splice things, you're not getting the whole picture. And so there's another part of it that was, hey, there's some people who say, let's revise history. He was anti-tariff. And there's other people who say, no, he was completely pro-tariff, but he was somewhere in between, right?
He was like every one of us. We kind of, there's some fluidity there with how we feel about these certain things. And I think that really was the important aspect of this. He was very much for free trade, signed the first free trade agreement with Canada, which was the predecessor essentially to the NAFTA, which of course people then have had feelings about, and President Trump in his first term, addressed with Canada and Mexico. But he also very much believed that to protect certain industries and to actually keep capitalism and to keep the economy free and without specific constraints, sometimes tariffs were important. And he had just instituted tariffs on Japan related to semiconductors when he made that radio address. So,
but the premier in Ontario, if you watch the ad that the Ontario folks put together, it made it seem like tariffs are awful, they should never be used, it's a doomsday situation. Right. That was inaccurate because of the splicing. What were we missing in the other 3.5, 4 minutes of that?
That's exactly right. I think the other 3.5 or other 4 minutes really of the president's address there was the actual different nuances and the reasons why sometimes tariffs are appropriate. The president very much did say, the quotes that were used in that ad definitely came out of his mouth. It wasn't that they, like an AI type thing. It wasn't a deep fake. It was what he had said, but it was missing the context of when they're appropriate and when they're not. And his concept is if you just have, protectionism all the time and tariffs that are full throttle without any reason to do them, you're going to create less competition, which is going to be bad for free trade, or bad for business, bad for the economy, and bad for Americans ultimately. I think where Premier Ford, if I'm being really, as I thought about this, I think he really overstepped. Prime Minister Carney had just met with President Trump, and they were actually working towards the diplomatic solution, which is the right thing for the United States, the right thing for Canada, certainly for us here in Michigan. But the Ontario Premier went out and kind of went out above his skis and went against what his federal government was doing, and I think messed with the diplomacy. And you see how President Trump reacted.
Well, and any time, and whether you're a fan of President Trump or not, you know this about him, that to be the truth, that he watches the media very carefully, and he wants to see how he's perceived. It's important that people like him. And if diplomacy was working, this was the worst thing you could possibly do was basically try to whack him in the knee and say, ha, well, look what we did here. That was a terrible move.
I think it was a horrible move, and I think, it cut a few different ways.
Sure.
The president has been very much, he's been propping up President Reagan. He's got his big portrait in the Oval Office.
He admires
which is the first time he does. And he's trying to tap into those Reagan Republicans for good reason. I understand that. And I think that he was really making progress. And so now he retaliates essentially against the entire government of Canada because of Premier Ford's ad. And you see him now working on deals with China again, which is leaving some of us wondering what's going on here.
Well,
we need the Canadian issue worked out.
You do. And the mayor of Troy has a very vested interest in making sure that the relationship between Canada and the U.S. and that trade partnership works well. Why is that so important to Troy? You have a lot of suppliers right
We have a lot of suppliers in our city. We're a huge, our supply chain with the auto industry, with other industries, flows right through Troy, and a lot of it comes from Ontario and from Canada. And I worry about that. And I see our business owners struggling and having concerns about the future. I still ultimately believe that we're going to work out a great deal with Canada. I say that as somebody who knows that for the good of the country, for the good of Michigan, I do believe that's ultimately going to happen. But that uncertainty that we've talked about so many times, it continues to exist, and the businesses in the city of Troy and throughout Michigan need to have this issue resolved.
Perhaps Canada's on punitive hold right now as the president weighs his options and then perhaps comes back to the table again on his own terms, as President Trump is known to do.
Which is exactly what I think is likely to happen. And just as if I quickly, the whole concept that Premier Ford did this, he essentially acted as if a governor of a state in the United States was doing diplomacy outside of what the president of the United States is doing. And to me, that's a terrible way to do business for his own province. I mean, it really hurt him. I think it will hurt him more.
As you call it, an overstep. I think that regardless of where your political stripes lie, that's the truth in this particular case. It's an interesting one, and someone who knew President Reagan and his wife well. Ethan Baker, the mayor of Troy, it was great to have your perspective here tonight. Thanks for joining us on The Pulse.
Thanks, Roop. Appreciate it.